Hi, this is Stephen O'Grady from Redmonk. Welcome to the MongoDB podcast. Like I said, what we're trying to measure as best we can, and it's an imperfect process, but as best we can, we're trying to measure how much our language is being talked about, sort of over on the Stack Overflow side and asked about, and what's the activity there? And then, what is the actual trajectory of things on the code side, right? In terms as measured by pull requests.
Welcome to the show. That was the voice of Stephen O'Grady. He's the co-founder and principal analyst at Redmonk. We're also joined by Rachelle Palmer, the software driver space at MongoDB. So Rochelle, Stephen, Nic, and I are talking about the language report that's produced by Redmonk. This report ranks languages based on their popularity, using things like GitHub, pull requests, Stack Overflow, discussions. It's a great discussion about the popularity of languages. There's some surprises in there. I think you'll enjoy it if you're interested in software development languages. Before we get to the show, I'd like to ask for your help. Give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. We'd greatly appreciate that. If you're listening on YouTube, give us a thumbs up. Subscribe. You're also welcome to join us on the community. If you want to discuss this episode or anything related to MongoDB, you can find us in the community at community.mongodb.com. Hope to see you there, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
You're listening to the MongoDB Podcast. MongoDB Podcast? Exploring the world of software development, data, and all things MongoDB. And now your hosts, Michael Lynn and Nic Raboy.
Hey, Nic, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Mike. Today we have kind of a unique episode, I think, for this podcast, right?
Yeah, we've got a couple of guests. Rochelle, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Fantastic. Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I joined MongoDB in 2013, so one of the old guard here at the company, pre-IPO. When I first joined, I joined our cloud engineering team, and then I moved on to create and run our technical services support team for everything but server, which includes security, application code, load balancers, all of the other various products that MongoDB builds. And then now I run product for database experience for all of our official programming languages.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you on the show. Let's welcome Stephen O'Grady from Redmonk. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about Redmonk?
Sure. So I'm one of the co-founders of Redmonk. It was founded a lot longer ago than either myself or my co-founder James Governor would care to admit. So we've been doing this for a little while. Redmonk is it's an analyst firm in that we do research, sort of like any other analyst firm, with the exception that our focus is largely on practitioners. So those could be developers, they could be DBAs, they could be operators, sysadmins, sort of you name it, right? Because our sort of core belief all along has been that the practitioner is increasingly sort of the audience deciding what gets used within businesses.
And so in that title of practitioner, what roles do we find in there? Is that just software developers? Is that operations? What roles fall into that?
It could be all of the above, right? It could absolutely be a database administrator. It could be a software developer. Could be sort of operations. Could be admins. Could be SRE. Sort of you name it. It just depends on what category and what area we're talking about. Basically what it comes down to is the people that we spend the most time thinking about are the folks in the trenches doing the actual work.
Yeah, interesting. And that's why we brought Rochelle to the party today, so we could talk a little bit about the overlap between the report, the research, and our product space, our developer experience space.
So Redmonk recently released a report on programming language rankings. You want to shed some light into why that report was published?
So way back when, I believe it was 2010 or thereabouts, there were two folks, Drew Conway and John Miles White, who thought it would be interesting to compare the popularity of languages, programming languages, on Stack Overflow and GitHub. And they did this, and sort of we at Redmonk thought, hey, this is really interesting. And they kind of did it as a lark, sort of as a, just essentially a curiosity on their part, right? What is the answer to this? What does this look like? So we picked it up and sort of used their approach. We've had to modify it over the years, as our access to APIs and the GitHub and Stack Overflow sides have changed. But like I said, we thought it was an interesting sort of look at on the one hand for GitHub, what source code is actually getting written, and then on the Stack Overflow side, what code is being discussed, right? And sort of what are the trends? Are they up? Are they down? How do things compare relative to one another? So we started doing it, shortly after they published it, and we've been doing it, really ever since. So now we have a pretty good, historical record going back a ways of how these, sort of all these languages compare to one another, sort of on the basis of GitHub and Stack Overflow, which, I feel the need to include, the sort of necessary disclaimer that, this is not a perfect process in the sense that there are languages in usage, things like COBOL, for example, is that a lot of businesses, it doesn't show up here because it's not represented in GitHub. So we're not trying to survey what is actually in usage, right? This is just what is sort of, a topic of conversation at, in these two properties. We always have folks, who are, sort of upset at, hey, my language isn't featured, or it doesn't account for this, or doesn't account for that. It's just, if we had access to everybody's, sort of enterprise repositories, we'd look at that. But, this is the next best thing. So yeah, that's how it got started.
So year after year, do you add stuff to the report that says, such and such language has become more popular versus last year kind of thing in this report?
Yeah. So as a companion piece, we started this a couple of years ago. You used to have to kind of have to piece this together because we just dropped the rankings and, had people essentially refer to previous iterations, right? To see, okay, what's sort of gone up and down. Since then, we have started producing a historical record. So I usually drop the sort of ranking of the plot on my side of the site, and then Rachel, who does a lot of the quantitative rather legwork, for the rankings, does a historical record. So in other words, you can look at over the entire history of our rankings, where has each language placed over time, which gives you a lot more context.
Got it. And let's go based off the latest report, I guess. Did anything surprise you? Like, were you surprised by any of the languages and how they ranked?
I don't know that surprise is the right word. There are things that I think are always notable, right? So TypeScript, continues to grow, which we find notable. So one of the things to sort of keep in mind with the rankings is that they're accretive in the sense that basically they count. It's not a snapshot of what happened last quarter. It's a snapshot of what has happened since, as long as we've been doing these rankings, right? So, you can imagine that, people have written a lot of JavaScript over the last 10 years. And therefore a language that's sort of new to the scene has to, make up a lot of ground, right? To sort of, compete on that basis. So the fact that TypeScript in a very short span of time has cracked the top 10 and been able to sustain its place there and grow it is really pretty notable, from our perspective. R is another language that sort of continues to surprise. I know for a couple of years, on the data science side, there've been people saying, everything's going to Python. We haven't seen that. R continues to perform pretty well. Yeah, Ruby's decline is also interesting. We have seen it sort of in a flat to decline period for, sort of a number of years now, which, Ruby fans get very upset. And to be clear, look, it's still in the top 10, and even being in the top 20 means you are, an immensely successful language. So all credit due, but that sort of trajectory, I think, has been interesting to watch.
My question looking at the rankings is, could you clarify for the listeners, when we look at the TOB rank or the Stack Overflow developer rankings, Swift is a 13 or 15, and in the Redmonk rankings, it's an 11. So how do you explain the difference?
So a lot of it comes down to what you're measuring, right? So in other words, Stack Overflow obviously is measuring Stack Overflow. TOB uses a sort of mix of different things. I don't know that they publish their exact methodology, but I know it includes like search, sort of rankings, and there's other pieces in there. So the net is that, like any other system, right? The rankings are a product of their inputs. So we use different inputs than both of those rankings. So our rankings are, pretty logically, I think, going to be a little different. What we're trying to do, and this is, like I said, it goes back to Drew and, John's original work, is try to have some reflection, not just of discussion, as it were, but also, the actual code usage. feeling that, we're representing both. Now, again, there are issues with that in the sense that there are programming language communities. Well, Mathematica is an example, right? So they have their own, sort of Stack Overflow flavor, which isn't measured in ours. Other communities spend most of their time in places other than Stack Overflow, right? It could be IRC, it could be Discord, Slack, and so on. And therefore, they're underweighted, relatively speaking, sort of along that axis, for us. I mean, basically, it comes down to everybody does their rankings a little differently and is looking for different things. And as a result, the results are, they're going to be, they're going to skew one way or another.
So for the folks that are listening, the report exists on the Redmonk site. And Steve, I guess the first thing is how do folks get a hold of the report? How can they access this?
So if you go to redmonkrankings.com as a URL, that'll redirect you to the page on my site. And then for the historical rankings, if you just go over to redmonk.com, it's one of the featured, sort of pieces. So you'll be able to find that there.
For the folks listening, the report contains a number of languages, and there's the largest piece I think that's interesting is the plot, which shows the utilization and the language rankings. And then under that, we have the listing of rankings, and notable at the top, we've got JavaScript, then Python, Java, PHP, fifth spot. And it seems like there's a shared fifth spot between C# and C++. And then we've got, also at the same spot is CSS, and then TypeScript, and then Ruby on down. And we've got 19 languages listed. And you mentioned the methodology for collecting and ranking these around discussions in Stack Overflow. You also mentioned GitHub, and I'm curious about the methodology for GitHub. Is it sheer repos that are tagged as that language, or does it take into consideration the activity on each repo?
Yeah, so we're looking at pull requests rather than straight repos, right? So we're looking at pull requests essentially ranked by language. The process has changed, sort of over the years, in the sense that in the early days, GitHub themselves ranked the languages. So we just went in and, sort of looked at, okay, here's their rankings. We use those as, sort of our source. They did away with that. So, then we had to find ways to do it. So what we do now is there's a archive of GitHub activity. We just go in and look for that, and we do pull requests. And like I said, so we do, sort of every quarter, or in this case, actually 2 quarters, we pull the last 2 quarters data and throw it onto the rest of the data that we've collected. Stack Overflow, we look at tags. GitHub, we're looking at pull requests. And like I said, what we're trying to measure as best we can, and it's an imperfect process, but as best we can, we're trying to measure how much our language is being talked about, sort of over on the Stack Overflow side and asked about, and what's the activity there. And then, what is the actual trajectory of things on the code side, right? In terms as measured by pull requests. As I said, there are always corner cases where, something doesn't, sort of work for one reason or another. But this is, I guess, the way that I typically answer it is that if somebody has a better way for us to rank these things and pull the data, we're happy to hear it. But for now, these are the best sources we found.
When we're talking about pull requests for GitHub, are we doing any kind of thresholding or anything along those lines? Because what if these pull requests are very small, one line of code versus a million lines of code kind of thing?
We do some things to sort of filter, right? So in other words, we're doing things like, okay, so pull requests on forks and so on sort of are filtered and excluded. But, I'd have to talk to Rachel. I don't believe we're doing any thresholding as far as size of contribution, so we're trying to make sure that we're not pulling in the same data, obviously multiple times. It's kind of like people always get on us for including CSS. There are certain things that we have to pull out, but we try not to editorialize, right? We're trying to not inject ourselves into this, this discussion, is try to, rely as much as we can on the quantitative metrics, right? So in other words, their linguist classifier says that CSS is a language, so we use it. And likewise, it'd be really difficult for us to measure pull requests at scale in terms of their sheer size. So we try not to.
So Rochelle, I'm interested in your take on the report. Did anything shock you or give you pause when you were looking at the results? And maybe also tell a little bit about the software driver space, the driver space at MongoDB, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. MongoDB has 12 official programming languages, and then we also have a number of community-built drivers for other programming languages where we don't officially maintain them, but we weigh in, we may contribute code.
We may sponsor the developer occasionally and definitely talk to them on a regular basis. So a good example of that is the R driver. Reports like these are super useful to me as a product manager, obviously, but I also think any software company where you're looking at providing a library or a framework to specific groups of developers. Things that were interesting or shocking about the report, I had also seen data about the descent, if you will. Maybe we don't want to call it descent, that's a scary word, of Go. And that was also echoed in this report. I think it's really interesting. MongoDB has a large usage share of the Go developer community. I think more than 32% of Go developers use or know MongoDB. So that's a little worrisome, perhaps. And then some of the languages where we are investing are still not in the top 10, right? So we invest a lot in Swift, we are investing a lot in Rust. And so I hope to see those languages flourish.
And then in terms of the rankings, does that line up with what we're seeing in terms of popularity for the software driver space for MongoDB?
Yeah, pretty much. Obviously, the most popular language with MongoDB is still JavaScript, Node.js. We benefited greatly as a company from the mean stack from a few years ago and then the follow-up MERN stack. So it remains the most popular language to use with MongoDB, but actually, our second most popular language is actually Java, followed by C#. So I think that, the top 5 are for the Redmonk report are this top 5 for MongoDB by revenue and by size of community. So that's consistent.
So in terms of the data from the report, Steve, what are people doing with this data?
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the primary use cases is for individual developer communities to fight with one another. We see a lot of battles on Hacker News and Reddit and so on. So that's certainly one input. I think it does serve as quantitative input. For some folks looking to make decisions like drivers, right? So in other words, very we have a sort of Redmonk over the years had many companies come to us and say, okay, look, I know I need to add support for another language or two. Like, which one should I support and why? And we don't just hand them the report, of course, because things are market and context dependent. And in spite of the fact that one language is ranked higher, another language may be more appropriate given a sort of particular use case. But people are do use it sort of as input for that. But then also, I think that there's there's an element to the communities themselves, right? The language communities, I mean, in terms of, again, this is not a canonical, this is not the sort of accurate state of play. It's not the definitive measurement of everything that's going on. But, you do look at these trends over time, and some of the language communities will look at them and say, okay, hey, this is great for us, or this is a problem for us, and what are the kinds of things that we need to look at? Like I've had, just as one example, Go has been interesting because we've had a bunch of, it grew very quickly initially, and then it kind of plateaued. And when you look at it, what is it? It's usually in the sort of 15-ish range, within sort of a spot or two. But it's also not clear that they have, sort of a ton of upside, from there. Java has remained robust, a robust competitor. Rust is emerging, as a competitor for those server-side workloads. Unlike Java or Kotlin, it doesn't have a mobile story. Question is, if you're the Go community, like, how do you grow from here, right? What are the new use cases, workloads, communities, et cetera, that you can bring into the fold to expand your base? So anyway, I think, again, not every language community does this, but some of them look at it and say, all right, hey, this may be, sort of useful input, if only for a discussion of where we're at, right, and where we're headed.
Yeah, I also want to say, one of my quotes that I've made to multiple people is that we shouldn't focus so much on like using these kind of data points to say whether or not a community or a language is dying, because, lucky for us as developers, we don't die if a language loses its popularity, even though we know it. And so you look at some of these very long-lived languages, they still have very large communities, even though they don't have the hype and they don't have the buzz. But you still have really large enterprises using that language for production apps. You can still find a job very easily. And just because a language has gone from, ninth to 11th place over a 3-year period doesn't mean that there's going to be this like mass exodus of developers, nor does it mean that everyone is just going to stop writing code in that language. So,
Yeah.
I hope people don't take that away from some reports like these.
No, and I think, look, we try to include, sort of all the necessary caveats, and the difficulty with our caveats is that no one ever seems to read them,
Right.
because we get all these objections. It's like, no, that's actually in there as a caveat. Like, that is important to stress, because like I mentioned COBOL earlier, COBOL is a really important language, for a lot of enterprises. It's not, current, it's not popular. It's not even on these rankings, right? So you have that. And then, I mentioned Ruby earlier. There are dozens, if not hundreds of languages that would kill to be in 9th place, right? So your trajectory is not, maybe what you want, but, the level of usage, level of discussion, et cetera, still makes you a very, very popular language in it, sort of in your own right. So we do occasionally see some, I guess, more dramatic takes on the news here, and we try to discourage that whenever possible, right? All we're trying to do is check in twice a year and just take a pulse of how things are performing relative to one another. That's basically it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's an argument to be made that once you become a massive language, the word community doesn't really apply to you anymore in some ways, right? Some of the language communities, they are really small right now, and it's kind of nice. You know the major contributors, you know the founder by their first name. They'll actually respond to you on Twitter or email really quickly. And when you get to a larger size, that's just not true anymore. It's like working at 100,000 person company and trying to get a meeting with the CEO. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Rochelle had mentioned that MongoDB actually became successful in the JavaScript community because of things like the mean stack and the MERN stack. Do you think that JavaScript is kind of remaining at the number one spot because of all the frameworks around it? Like you said, TypeScript is on the rise. Do you think it's rising in popularity due to its ability to work for C# developers, JavaScript developers, I think even Dart developers?
Yeah, so I think, frameworks are absolutely important, vital, in fact, to adoption. We've seen this over and over. Ruby, for example, was catapulted into popularity, because of, the Rails framework once upon a time. Node, did a ton for JavaScript's popularity, sort of once upon a time. So there's no doubt that, if you look at sort of frameworks, in the JavaScript community, one, there's a lot of them, and two, many of them are popular. And that absolutely contributes to popularity. But honestly, the thing with JavaScript, which I think, differentiates it and gives it an advantage, it's just so versatile, right? It can do literally anything you want. It's used in mobile, it's used in web front ends, it's used in back ends. In some cases, it's used as glue cut. Like, it's just pick an area, and somewhere there is somebody doing something with JavaScript in that area, right? And that's just not true of most languages. That's why, and I mentioned R as a surprise, right? R is basically, you just do, statistical analysis, right? That's it. It doesn't have any, you're not writing web front ends or mobile clients in R, right? That's just not what it's for. That's why R has been a surprise, sort of, in the, being as popular as it is. But it's also why R is, solidly in the back end of the top 10, outside of the top 10 rather, versus JavaScript, which is atop the rankings because it can do literally anything. So yeah, I think it's the versatility at least as much as the frameworks, I guess, is the short answer.
Okay, I have a question. What language do you personally want to see make it into the top 10?
That's a good one. Honestly, I think the one for me would actually be R, shockingly, just because it's funny when this was years ago. I had somebody from the R community, somebody I didn't know. R had dropped a couple spots and it had been written up as like, oh, hey, is this, are we seeing impact from Python or whatever? And they got very upset and accused me of not liking R. And I had to reply, I'm like, the plot in this language ranking that you're looking at was rendered in R, right? That's what I used to do the actual analysis. So my programming days are, I don't, other than sort of dabbling here and there in JavaScript and Python, and a couple other things, from time to time, sort of largely for either toy stuff on my own or, sort of pulling data, for various things. R is what I deal with most day to day. I'd love to see R get in the top 10, but like I said, it's a pretty narrow domain. So that'll be a tough sell.
For me, it's Dart. I think it's super cool. I want to see it succeed. I want to see it surpass Swift and Kotlin.
This was a good ranking for Dart.
It was.
We hadn't seen it move in a while. It was languishing. And going back to the earlier question about frameworks, this was a case where Flutter has done a world of good for Dart, because Dart was hovering, I'd have to go back and look, I think in the 30s, and just charged up the rankings, since Flutter hit, what was it, 1.0, I think.
Not that they'll appreciate the analogy, but I think of it as like some little small town team showing up to play the Yankees. It's like really cool. Cheer them as they walk on the field.
There you go. Yeah, I love it.
So there's this whole space in like fast data and streaming technologies like Kafka and similar. I'm just wondering if you've given thought to including things like that in frameworks like that in the rankings.
So this may not be a surprise, but as we started doing these, and more importantly, as they started to become more popular, right? Because in other words, depending on what happens to the rankings, these posts can do big traffic, at least big traffic in the world of tech. Hundreds of thousands of page views, those kinds of things. So as they became sort of more popular and more visible, a lot of people approached us and wanted us to rank other things, right? Like, okay, go out and rank application platforms, go out and rank databases, go out and rank this, that, and the other thing. And basically, what it has come down to is that you can measure anything, right? In other words, TOB, as we mentioned earlier, for example, uses search engine ranking, so you can absolutely go out and pull some of these things in. We just haven't found a good way to do that, sort of in other areas, in a way that we feel good about. Like, we keep looking at it. And if we find a way to, look at databases, look at streaming platforms and so on in a way that we feel is not just a ranking for ranking's sake, because like I said, we can go out and, gin up metrics wherever and say, yeah, here's our rankings and so on. But in a way that we feel is not perfect, the language rankings aren't perfect, but in a way that's sort of intellectually, defensible and useful, then we'll do that. But, thus far, it's hard to find, it's hard to find sort of ways that you can measure things the same way. Languages are, sort of just by, their nature, you can measure, okay, who's doing what with these, right? Just by pull requests, as we talked about earlier. And that's much harder to do with like who's using databases and so on. Short answer is we're working on it. We think about it, but we don't have anything. We haven't found the solution to that problem just yet.
Awesome, Stephen. This was great stuff. Is there anything that we might have missed that you wanted to share with the listeners of this podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that the big thing for me, which we talked about a little bit, is just putting all of this in context. Putting this in context to say, what do these rankings mean, right? Because like I said, the biggest thing that people do is, one community goes off and says, we're better than another because, these rankings, we ranked higher, whatever. And first of all, particularly the further you go down the rankings, the smaller and smaller the distinctions are that we're talking about. Like the difference between 1 and 2 is often significant. The difference between like 20 and 30 is not that big a deal, like in most cases. So what we try to do always when we get people to think about the rankings, just consider them, look at them over time, but also just don't get carried away, right? These are not this is not a lottery, right? This is not, the Super Bowl. This is not, they're interesting, they're fun. We were very glad and we appreciate that people enjoy them. But yeah, maybe a little less combat via, community combat via rankings would be great.
Awesome. And Rochelle, this is your first time on the podcast, and it was great having you. Do you have anything that we might have missed that you want to add?
No, probably not. Fun fact: we just rewrote our node driver in TypeScript, so I guess we're committed to TypeScript here as well.
There you go.
It's pretty good.
Fantastic. Well, Stephen, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. We'll include links to the report and some of the things that we mentioned in the show notes of the podcast. Thanks very much, Stephen and Rochelle, for joining us today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. Have a question or a suggestion for the show? Visit us in the MongoDB Community Forums at community.mongodb.com.